Welcome to Buried Truths, the home of thrilling detective stories, unsolved mysteries, and cases that keep you on the edge of your seat. Here, we uncover hidden secrets, shocking twists, and the dark corners where truth hides. From classic Whodunits to modern investigations, every story is crafted to immerse you in suspense and challenge your inner detective. Before we dive into today's mystery, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? We love seeing our Buried Truths family connecting from different countries, cities, and states across the world.
The 13th Teacup. Chapter 1, Lavender Biscuits and Curious Numbers. The spring afternoon in St. Mary Mead unfolded with the kind of delicate charm that could lull even the most restless soul into calm contentment. The air held that faint, earthy fragrance of damp hedgerows warmed by a sun not yet fully committed to summer. A gentle breeze carried with it the mingled scents of tulips just beginning to bloom, apple blossoms promising fruit, and the faint, dry tang of polished wood drifting out from the church hall windows. It was, in every sense, the sort of day that begged for tea, polite conversation, and perhaps a touch of village gossip. Inside Mrs. Eliza Witherton's sitting room, the occasion was already in motion. 12 ladies had gathered, each dressed in their best spring frocks and hats, each eager for conversation and the careful dance of civility that such afternoons demanded. Mrs. Witherton herself, a retired headmistress with a spine as straight as the brass poker by her hearth, presided with her customary air of authority. She had prepared her sitting room with meticulous attention to detail, lace curtains freshly starched, walnut table polished to a reflective sheen, and vases of tulips cut just that morning from her own garden. The guests were an assortment of the village's most notable women, from the vicar's wife with her ever-present knitting, to Lady Verwood, a titled widow who wore her grief as neatly as she did her pearls. The atmosphere was brisk but cheerful. The clink of china echoed with comforting regularity, punctuated by the crackle of biscuits being snapped in half, and the occasional titter when a small scandal was hinted at, Mrs. Parsons' runaway poodle being the latest subject of mirth. Seated modestly near the window, notebook tucked neatly into her handbag just in case, was Jessica Fletcher. She had arrived in St. Mary Mead 2 weeks earlier, ostensibly for a bit of quiet and to visit an old acquaintance, but anyone who knew Jessica also knew that quiet rarely lasted long in her company. Trouble, or mystery, had a way of drifting toward her like leaves toward a drain. Jessica wore a mauve cardigan with pearl buttons, simple but elegant. A tiny sprig of lavender was pinned at her collar, a personal flourish that spoke of both her literary sensibility and her playful rebellion against conformity. She stirred her tea gently, her pale blue eyes wandering over the room. Those eyes, so often described as kind, held now the watchful alertness of a woman who had seen too much of human nature to ever dismiss small irregularities. It was then, as the maid set down the second tray and Mrs. Witherton prepared to serve the lemon sponge, that Jessica noticed it, the tea service. 12 ladies sat around the table, but there were 13 cups. She blinked once, almost dismissing it as a slip of the eye. But Jessica Fletcher did not ignore details, not the kinds of details that had led her, time and again, into the heart of mysteries others preferred to overlook. Her gaze returned to the sideboard. The cups, each hand-painted with flowers, primroses, bluebells, snowdrops, violets, sat neatly arranged in rows. But there was one more than needed, and it sat just slightly apart, as if uncertain whether it belonged. The 13th cup bore forget-me-nots. Its rim was hairline cracked, the flaw so small it might have escaped another's notice. Jessica's lips pressed together thoughtfully. Mrs. Witherton, for all her brisk manner, was never careless. A woman who timed her life to the second would not err in her table settings. Jessica said nothing. She merely lifted her tea, smiling politely as Lady Verwood leaned forward to remark on the haunting tune that had just been played by Gwen Halbert. Gwen, tall and severe with steel-gray hair, had just risen from the piano. The melody, soft and oddly mournful, lingered in the air. "It's called Dors mon enfant," Gwen explained. "A lullaby I learned in Marseilles many years ago." The name of the tune struck Jessica like a pebble dropped in water, rippling through her thoughts. Lady Verwood, touching her forehead lightly, confessed that the song had made her feel faint. She laughed to disguise her unease, but Jessica noticed her trembling hands. The rest of the party carried on as expected. Polite conversation about flowers, a small digression about Colonel Easterbrook's memoirs, a shared laugh at Mrs. Pomeroy's forgetfulness with church notices. To anyone else, the gathering was unremarkable. But Jessica's gaze returned again and again to the untouched forget-me-not cup, its cracked rim catching the light. When the tea ended, the ladies drifted into the garden, admiring apple blossoms and exchanging compliments on each other's hats. Jessica, however, lingered indoors. She approached the tray once more. 12 cups bore the faint rings of tea. The 13th remained apart, spotless, untouched, as though it had been placed there not for drinking, but for some other purpose altogether. A presence behind her startled Jessica. She turned to see Gwen Halbert, still standing near the piano, her sharp profile outlined against the lace curtains. "You noticed it too," Gwen said softly. Jessica met her eyes. "The 13th cup?" "Yes." Gwen's smile was thin, almost bitter. "It isn't part of Mrs. Witherton's set. I brought it with me. My mother's cup. She used to say it held her memories better than her diary ever could." Jessica tilted her head. "And why place it on the tray today?" Gwen's gaze drifted to the garden where the others laughed among the tulips. Her eyes were distant, shadowed. "Because some memories refuse to be left out," she said at last. Without another word, she turned and joined the others. Jessica remained. She touched the cup's rim with one finger. The porcelain was rough, and at the bottom lay the faintest residue, not tea, not milk, but something darker, heavier. Her brow furrowed. A gust of wind rattled the window. From the garden came the sound of laughter, though muffled, distant, as if carried from another time. Jessica Fletcher, novelist, widow, and accidental detective, stood very still in that quiet sitting room. She had solved enough puzzles in her life to recognize when one had just begun. 13 cups. 12 guests. One fainting spell. One haunting lullaby. And one memory, cracked but not forgotten, waiting to be poured into the present. Something had started in St. Mary Mead that afternoon, something subtle and dangerous, wrapped in porcelain and song. And Jessica Fletcher, with her steady eyes and patient mind, would be the one to follow its trail. Chapter 2, A Song Remembered. The following morning in St. Mary Mead broke beneath a sky of uncertain gray, the kind of sky that wavered between promise and sorrow. Mist clung to the hedgerows, drifting across the lanes like a curtain reluctant to rise. The village stirred slowly, milk carts rattling, rooks cawing from the church tower, bicycles squeaking along damp cobbles. For most of the inhabitants, it was another day of chores and errands. For Jessica Fletcher, however, it was the day after a peculiar tea party, and the image of a cracked, forget-me-not teacup refused to leave her mind. She sat at her window with her morning tea untouched beside her. The newspaper on her lap remained folded, unread. Instead, she replayed the afternoon in her memory, Lady Verwood's faintness, Gwen Halbert's measured composure, the curious moment when Gwen had admitted to bringing that lone extra cup. Jessica's instinct told her the gesture had been deliberate, more deliberate than the woman had wanted to admit. By 9 o'clock, Jessica had wrapped herself in her rose-wool coat and set out for a walk. She exchanged polite greetings with Mr. Wakefield trimming his hedge and with young Sally from the post office who wobbled past on her bicycle, but her mind was already elsewhere. She followed the lane toward Mrs. Witherton's house, hoping that proximity to the setting of yesterday's strangeness might bring clarity. Instead, clarity brought itself. A black motorcar stood outside Mrs. Witherton's gate, its presence alone suggesting trouble. The front door stood ajar. Jessica paused, that familiar sensation prickling at the back of her neck, the recognition that a quiet line of village life had just been crossed. Inside, Mrs. Witherton's formidable posture was gone. She stood wilted in the hallway, pale and tight-lipped, her hands twisting the hem of her sleeve. She did not greet Jessica with her usual briskness. Instead she whispered, "She's dead, Jessica. Gwen Halbert. They found her in her garden just after dawn. The maid saw her through the window." Jessica's breath caught. "Sudden?" Mrs. Witherton's voice faltered. "They don't yet know. No signs of violence, but the doctor said she looked afraid. As if something had startled her in the last moment." A silence spread between them, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock in the hall. Jessica's voice was steady when she finally asked, "Did she take anything? A tonic, perhaps? Or a sleeping draught?" "I cannot say," Mrs. Witherton replied. "But you saw her yesterday, Jessica. Odd, wasn't she? That song, it unsettled me." Jessica nodded, though her thoughts were already racing. The melody Gwen had played, Dors mon enfant, was not merely a pleasant trifle dredged from memory. It had touched nerves, provoked tremors, and now one of the women who carried its memory was dead. Leaving Mrs. Witherton, Jessica turned down the lane not toward her lodgings, but toward Lady Verwood's ivy-covered brick house. The widow opened the door herself. Her face looked thinner in the morning light, almost translucent. "Jessica Fletcher," she said, startled. "I wasn't expecting anyone." "I won't keep you long," Jessica said kindly. "I only wanted to ask about the song Miss Halbert played yesterday. You seem to recognize it." Lady Verwood hesitated, her lips parting before closing firmly again. Finally, she admitted, "Yes. During the war, in Paris, I heard it often. A governess, odd, private, sang it to a child in our building. We shared rooms for a brief time. She sang it night after night." Jessica tilted her head. "And what became of them?" "I don't know." The answer came too quickly. "I left before the occupation worsened." Jessica's eyes studied the widow's pale hands clutching her shawl, but she did not press further. She only said softly, "It is a melancholy tune. A mother's lullaby." Lady Verwood gave a short nod, and Jessica took her leave, though unease weighed heavier now than before. In the churchyard she encountered Mrs. Pomeroy, the vicar's wife, trimming daffodils along the lych gate. A cheerful soul, she was quick to chatter. "Terrible business about Miss Halbert," she said. "She'd only been in St. Mary Mead 5 months. No family to speak of, though some said she had a sister lost in the Blitz. She kept to herself, mostly." Jessica thanked her and walked on, turning her steps at last toward the cottage where Gwen Halbert had lived. The garden where she had been found was modest, beds of forget-me-nots and lavender, violets at the path edges. Rain from the night before had left the soil dark and fragrant. The sight of it made Jessica's throat tighten. A woman who cherished flowers had died among them. Dr. Rawlings met her at the gate. His expression was grim. "Poison," he said. "Not the sort taken by accident. No wounds, no bruises. Just a shattered teacup beside her, looked like the one she carried yesterday." Jessica's mouth thinned. "The forget-me-not cup." He nodded. "We've sent the residue for testing. It wasn't tea. Something bitter, darker." Inside, Gwen's cottage revealed its secrets sparingly. The sitting room was neat but sparse. On the mantel stood a faded photograph, a young woman in uniform, holding a baby swaddled in white. The child's face had been deliberately scratched away. Jessica lingered on it, disturbed by the deliberate cruelty of such an act. In a locked desk drawer, opened with the doctor's permission, Jessica found a pressed red maple leaf and a torn diary page. The inked words were sharp, urgent. "I saw her again today. She does not know me, but I know what she did. She handed me over. She saved herself." Jessica folded the fragment carefully. Threads were beginning to show: the cup, the song, a fainting spell, now a letter of accusation. She stepped back into the garden as the wind picked up, rustling the violets at her feet. Near the flower bed, where the broken cup had been discovered, she noticed the soil disturbed. Kneeling, she brushed it aside and uncovered a shard of porcelain, floral, cracked, faintly stained. Not tea. Something bitter, chemical. Standing, Jessica felt the weight of it all. Gwen had carried her memories into the drawing room yesterday, embodied in a single fragile cup. Today those memories had silenced her forever. But Jessica Fletcher was not a woman to let a voice go unheard. The lullaby still threaded through her thoughts, haunting and unresolved. A melody meant to comfort children had drawn out fear in adults. Somewhere in that discord lay the truth. Jessica turned her gaze from the cottage back toward the village. In St. Mary Mead, beneath its calm exterior, something was stirring. And she, unwilling though she might sometimes be, was already caught in its current. Chapter 3: Whispers Behind Teacups. The village of St. Mary Mead reacted to Gwen Halbert's death with the sort of hush that speaks louder than bells. Curtains twitched more often than usual, voices lowered as neighbors passed one another on the lanes, and even the sparrows seemed reluctant to chatter at their accustomed volume. It was as though the entire community had drawn its breath, unsure what might be whispered next. Jessica Fletcher, however, moved through that silence with her usual steadiness. Years of living in Cabot Cove had taught her that communities were rarely as quiet as they pretended to be. Beneath hushed tones and lowered eyes, the truth stirred, restless and insistent. That afternoon, Jessica made her way once again to the Whodunit home. She carried with her a jar of marmalade, her small peace offering, and a sprig of mint from the vicarage garden. The house, though neat as ever, felt different now, the rooms heavy, curtains drawn more tightly, shadows holding longer in corners. Mrs. Whodunit answered the door. Her sharp edges were dulled. She guided Jessica into the parlor, where only 2 cups stood ready on the table. No delicate patterns this time, no gleaming array of painted blossoms, just plain white china, serviceable and unremarkable. When they were seated, Eliza Whodunit lowered her gaze to her lap. Her hands trembled faintly. "Jessica," she began, her voice softer than usual, "there's something I neglected to mention yesterday. After the ladies left, I noticed one of the place cards missing." Jessica's brow lifted. "Whose?" "Gwen's." Eliza exhaled sharply. "I assumed she tucked it into her bag as some peculiar keepsake. But now I wonder." Jessica stirred her tea slowly. Did she ever confide in you about her life before coming here? Only once. Mrs. Witherton frowned, her eyes drifting toward the window. She said she had worked with displaced children in France during the war. She used to hum lullabies when she thought no one was listening. She hesitated. I never asked questions. It felt painful for her. Jessica's gaze softened. And yet she arrived at your table with a cup that did not belong. That was no accident. Eliza shook her head helplessly. I can't explain it. Jessica did not argue. Her mind, however, was turning. Some objects were not tokens of sentiment but signals, clues intended to be recognized by the right eyes. Gwen had carried her cup into the room not to drink from it, but to remind someone of a story unfinished. Leaving the Witherton home, Jessica made her way to the village constabulary. The small station smelled faintly of coal smoke and ink. Constable Reeves, young but earnest, sat behind a modest desk with a fountain pen between his fingers. He looked up quickly when Jessica entered. Mrs. Fletcher, he said, trying to sound official but betraying relief. I suppose you've come about Miss Halbert. Jessica inclined her head. I have. Reeves shuffled his papers. Nothing final yet, but the coroner suspects foxglove poisoning. Digitalis, concentrated. It acts swiftly, especially in liquid. Jessica folded her hands. And the teacup found beside her? Broken. Residue on the fragments, bitter, brown, unmistakably not tea. We've sent samples to London. Reeves hesitated before adding, one of the lads cut himself handling it. Ugly stuff. Jessica leaned forward slightly. Was there anything else at the cottage? Reeves glanced down before producing a folder. A letter. Found wedged behind a chest of drawers in the spare room. He slid it across. Unsigned. Perhaps you'd like to read it. Jessica adjusted her glasses and opened the faded envelope. The handwriting was tight, slanted, as though written in haste. If I die suddenly, it is no accident. Someone here knows what happened in 1944. I recognize her face, though her name is different. Hair can change, stories can change, but eyes do not. Jessica replaced the letter gently, her expression calm though her thoughts sharpened. She returned the folder to Reeves. Have you shown this to Inspector Cray? Not yet. He arrives from the county tomorrow. Jessica gave a short nod. She had no wish to outpace the inspector, but withholding her observations had never been in her nature. This is not the first time Gwen tried to speak out, she murmured. That evening, Jessica sought quiet in the village library. Few people ever lingered there after supper, only a yawning clerk half asleep at his desk kept watch. She requested the wartime lodging register for Hampshire, a heavy tome filled with cramped handwriting. She read by the yellow glow of a desk lamp, turning page after page until her eyes ached. At last she found it. Halbert, Genevieve C., billeted at Fern Hollow Cottage, April 1944. Occupation, translator. Status, discharged January 1945. Below, another entry, child, female, unnamed, approximately 1 year. Line struck through. No record of discharge. Someone had tried to erase the child, but a faint red pencil mark remained, imperfectly rubbed out. Jessica copied the register number into her notebook. The next morning she returned to Lady Verwood's residence. The ivy-clad walls and discreet curtains of the widow's home now seemed less like modesty and more like concealment. Lady Verwood received her with strained courtesy. Mrs. Fletcher. You do keep unusual hours. I beg your pardon for intruding, Jessica said lightly, stepping into the drawing room. But I find myself curious about the governess you mentioned. The one who sang that French lullaby during the war. The widow's eyes hardened. I don't know why this matters. Jessica traced her fingertips lightly along the spines of the books on the shelf. Dust patterns revealed which volumes had been touched and which had not. Without looking up, she said, because she stayed with you. And there was a child. Lady Verwood froze. Jessica turned, her voice quiet but unyielding. That child vanished. The lodging record notes her presence, then strikes her out. No one reported it. But Gwen Halbert's letter accused a woman whose story had changed but whose eyes remained the same. The widow's face drained of color. She wasn't supposed to come back. Jessica's gaze held steady. She came not to accuse you, but to remind you. She wanted acknowledgement. Perhaps forgiveness. She threatened me, Lady Verwood whispered. No, Jessica said gently. She offered you the chance to speak the truth. She brought the 13th cup, a pattern you had once known. She played that song deliberately, so you would remember. Lady Verwood sank into a chair. Her denial was weak. I didn't kill her. Jessica's tone softened. Perhaps not. But someone else feared what her return might mean. And that fear has proved fatal. When Jessica stepped back into the lane, the afternoon air felt sharper. The hedges rustled with a restless wind, carrying with it not only the fragrance of damp soil but the weight of secrets that refused to remain buried. The lullaby echoed faintly in her mind, the melody of memory and betrayal. St. Mary Mead had grown quieter, yes, but Jessica knew that silence only ever meant one thing. Somewhere among the villagers, a truth waited, and it would not stay hidden for long. Chapter 4, The Widow's Garden. Morning in St. Mary Mead arrived with a deceptive brightness. The sun, pale but determined, shone across dew-laden grass, turning the village green into a patchwork of silver diamonds. Yet beneath the charm of spring, a heaviness clung to the air. The talk of Gwen Halbert's poisoning had not diminished, it had only grown quieter, more furtive, carrying itself in half-finished remarks between neighbors at the bakery, in hurried whispers by the post office, in the lowered eyes of parishioners leaving the churchyard. Jessica Fletcher rose early, her mind already rehearsing what needed to be done. The fragments of Gwen's story remained scattered, and if she had learned anything through years of uninvited cases, it was that gardens, literal or metaphorical, often concealed what people hoped never to unearth. By mid-morning, Jessica stood before Gwen Halbert's cottage again. The small house seemed lonelier now, its ivy clinging more tightly to the stone as though to guard it. Constable Reeves, reluctant but respectful of her insight, had granted her a short visit to the garden. Don't touch anything you shouldn't, he'd warned with youthful severity. Jessica had only smiled, replying that she rarely touched more than was necessary. The garden bore the marks of both care and neglect. Rows of violets and lavender had once been clipped neatly, but weeds had begun to creep through, tugging at the order Gwen had tried to maintain. A climbing rose had overtaken the shed at the back, curling like determined fingers through the cracked slats. Jessica stood quietly among the damp beds, the hem of her coat brushing against wet leaves, the scent of soil thick in the morning air. She crouched near the lavender. Something about the soil seemed disturbed, not by spades or rakes but by hurried hands. She brushed away a thin crust of earth and uncovered a fragment of porcelain no larger than a coin. Its glaze caught the light, forget-me-not blue. Another piece of the shattered cup. Inside the shed, gloom settled heavily. Dust floated in streaks of sunlight breaking through the warped boards. On the shelf lay an old thermos, a cracked flower pot, and a biscuit tin with its lid ajar. Jessica lifted it. Inside were photographs, bound with a faded ribbon. She studied them one by one. The first showed Gwen, years younger, standing beside a milestone in France with a bicycle leaning against the stone. Her smile was determined, not joyful. Another photograph depicted her holding a swaddled infant, though the child's face had been scratched away, echoing the cruelty Jessica had already seen in the cottage. Other photographs followed, groups of children, nameless, bomb-damaged buildings, uniformed men and women with their faces partially obscured or violently crossed out. Then Jessica paused on one image that chilled her. A tea service laid out on a courtyard table, unmistakably the same pattern as the forget-me-not cup. 13 cups arranged neatly, captured in black and white, yet carrying the same disquiet as yesterday's gathering. She replaced the photographs carefully, then examined the floorboards at the back of the shed. One plank bore faint scratches where it had been lifted. Jessica knelt, prying gently with the handle of the flower pot until the board shifted. Beneath lay a rusted tin box. Inside were scraps, letters, newspaper clippings, fragments of diaries. One envelope stood out, marked Mallory, May 1944. Jessica unfolded the brittle paper with care. If anyone finds this, know the child was not lost. She was taken. The woman who called herself Lady Mallory was no true guardian. She vanished before I could act. I believe she reinvented herself. Perhaps even married into a title. If she is in England, she must be found. Jessica drew a sharp breath. The name Mallory was no stranger now. Mrs. Vera Mallory had been listed in the billeting records she examined the night before. And Lady Verwood, so composed, so evasive, suddenly wore a far darker shadow. Later that day, the charity auction drew villagers to the hall. Tables were laden with books, knitted scarves, and sponge cakes. On the surface, it was a cheerful affair, but Jessica noted how many pairs of eyes lingered nervously on her. News traveled fast in small communities, and everyone knew she was already prying into Gwen's death. Lady Verwood stood by a table of books, her smile polite, her gloves immaculate. Jessica approached with the ease of an old friend, plucking a volume from the pile. Apollinaire, she remarked lightly. French poetry. How curious to find it here. Lady Verwood stiffened. A relic. I have no use for it. Jessica opened the book, noticing a slip of paper marking a page. The verse spoke of hidden children, walls that listened, songs sung in secret. Jessica closed the book softly, her voice even. It reads almost like something from the Resistance. Lady Verwood said nothing, but the tightness of her jaw betrayed her. Jessica continued gently. I consulted the records yesterday. Your name never appeared in Red Cross service lists under your maiden name. Curious, isn't it? Unless, of course, you once lived under another. The widow's eyes flashed. Jessica leaned closer. Gwen did not come to accuse you of murder. She wanted acknowledgement. She carried her mother's cup, the very pattern you once saw in France, and she played the lullaby so you would remember. She wanted you to admit what had been hidden. Lady Verwood's voice cracked. I didn't poison her. I swear it. I believe you, Jessica replied quietly. But someone did, and perhaps for your sake. That evening Jessica sat in the constabulary with Inspector Cray, a man newly arrived from the county. He was large, methodical, and skeptical of village chatter. Yet he listened as Jessica placed the photographs and the note before him. "This was no accident," Jessica said steadily. "Gwen Halbert was once Genevieve Aubriac, the child of a French family erased during the war. She carried proof of her identity, the cup, the photographs, the pressed leaf she tucked into her diary. She came to the tea not for vengeance, but for recognition. And someone feared what that recognition would cost." Cray studied her closely. "Who?" Jessica's gaze fell on the name scrawled in the old letter. "Mollari." The name Lady Verwood had tried to bury. And yet, Jessica felt another presence behind it, someone closer, someone who had controlled the gathering with meticulous order. "Eliza Witherton," Jessica said softly. "Search her house. Not Lady Verwood's." Rain began to fall against the constabulary windows, steady and unyielding. Outside, in Gwen's garden, violets shivered under the drops, their roots pressing deeper into the soil. A woman had carried her memories into a cup, hoping to be seen. Instead, she had been silenced. But Jessica Fletcher would not allow silence to be the last word. Chapter 5, The Man with the Scar. Rain fell steadily over St. Mary Mead the following morning, drumming lightly against slate roofs and dripping from the eaves in slender streams. Villagers hurried along the lanes beneath umbrellas, shoulders hunched, their conversations hushed beneath the weather. For most, the rain was an inconvenience. For Jessica Fletcher, it was the perfect curtain, one that concealed more than it revealed, and in such concealment, truth often stirred. Jessica sat in her lodgings near the fire, a notebook on her lap. She had spent the night revisiting every detail, Gwen's deliberate cup, Lady Verwood's evasions, Eliza Witherton's odd restraint. Yet there was something still unresolved, a shadow between the lines. Inspector Cray, now officially overseeing the case, had promised her that discreet inquiries into Mrs. Witherton's past would be made. Jessica trusted Cray's diligence, but she knew better than to sit idle. Just before noon, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Constable Reeves stood dripping wet on the threshold, hat in hand. His youthful face looked troubled. "You were right, Mrs. Fletcher," he said. "There's something in Eliza Witherton's past we hadn't accounted for. A brother. Edward Witherton. Officially recorded as a prisoner of war, missing since 1944. Jessica motioned him inside, gesturing toward the fire. "And Gwen?" Reeves lowered his voice. "One of the coded letters you found mentions betrayal. A name, Edward W. It seems Gwen linked him to something that happened in France. Whatever that betrayal was, it cost him his freedom, perhaps his life." Jessica set her teacup down gently. "And Eliza never spoke of him?" "No, ma'am. It's as if she erased him entirely." Jessica nodded. The omission was telling. Families sometimes buried their shame as neatly as they buried their dead. By late afternoon, the rain eased into a mist, and Jessica left her lodgings with her umbrella angled against the drizzle. She walked the quieter back lanes, instinct guiding her rather than plan. Behind the inn, on a narrow path seldom used, she saw him, a tall, narrow-shouldered man leaning heavily on a cane. His mackintosh coat was soaked at the hem, his hat pulled low. But Jessica needed only a glance to notice the deep scar curving from his ear down to his jaw. She approached with the courtesy of a stranger yet the steadiness of a woman who had already guessed. "Good afternoon, Mr. Lennox," she said. The man started, turning toward her with narrowed eyes. His left leg dragged slightly as he shifted his weight. "I wanted to thank you," Jessica continued, as if speaking of ordinary things, for the chrysanthemums you left at the churchyard. They brightened the vicar's step. Quite thoughtful. Lennox relaxed slightly, though his expression remained guarded. I used to grow them. Old habits, I suppose. They walked a few paces together, the lane glistening with rainwater. Jessica let silence stretch until it grew heavy. Then she said, almost absently, I once knew a man with a scar very like yours. He served as a courier during the war. Risked everything to deliver a message. Nearly died for it. Lennox's step faltered. Jessica continued, her tone light, as though reminiscing. He was betrayed, of course. Someone who knew his route had passed it on. The enemy was waiting exactly where he would be. Lennox stopped walking. His hand gripped the head of his cane so tightly his knuckles whitened. What is it you want, madam? Jessica met his gaze without hesitation. The truth. What happened to Gwen Halbert? His eyes flickered. I had nothing to do with her death. I never said you did, Jessica answered calmly. But you recognized her at the tea, didn't you? Just as she recognized you. The scarred man looked away, jaw tightening. She remembered. I saw it in her eyes. After all these years. Did you betray her? Jessica asked softly. Lennox's silence was an answer in itself. He turned sharply, limping away into the mist, leaving Jessica alone in the lane. She remained still, her umbrella forgotten at her side. She did not believe Lennox had killed Gwen, but his guilt carried its own weight. The kind of guilt that bent a man's spine far more than any war wound. That evening, Jessica invited Inspector Cray and Constable Reeves to her lodgings for tea. She served lemon scones and cucumber sandwiches, the comfort of the table disguising the gravity of the discussion. I believe, Jessica began once the plates were set aside, that Gwen's death was not merely about the past. It was about what survived from it. Cray leaned forward, his massive hands folded over his notepad. Explain. Eliza Witherton had a brother who vanished after betrayal. Gwen's letters suggest she suspected who had caused it. She may have discovered that Edward was not merely a victim of chance but of deliberate treachery. Eliza's silence about him suggests complicity, if not in action, then in shame. Reeves frowned. But how does that lead to murder? Jessica's expression grew solemn. Because Gwen didn't stop with Edward. She traced a larger web. She uncovered the connection between Eliza and another identity, Vera Mollari, the woman named in the wartime records, the one accused of abandoning a child. A woman who vanished only to reappear under another name. Cray's brow furrowed. You believe Eliza and Vera Mollari are the same? Jessica nodded. And Gwen had proof. Photographs, letters, the porcelain itself, a token of recognition. The 13th cup was no sentimental trinket. It was a challenge. A message, I remember you. Reeves leaned back, shaking his head. But Eliza never left her seat at the tea. Gwen poured her own drink. No one touched her cup. Jessica opened her notebook. On the page was a small sketch she had drawn, a teacup with a faint crack along the rim. This was no ordinary accident. A cracked rim can be prepared days in advance. Powdered digitalis hidden in the fissure. Invisible until liquid releases it. Cray exhaled. So the poison was waiting. Gwen brought the cup herself, thinking it carried only memory, never knowing it had already been turned into a weapon. Jessica's voice dropped. Eliza knew Gwen would use that cup. She made sure it would betray her, just as betrayal had defined their past. Silence hung in the room. The only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock. At last, Cray stood. "We'll bring her in tonight." But Jessica's eyes, steady and sorrowful, lingered on the window where rain traced slow patterns. "Hurry," she murmured. Because people who live with lies all their lives do not easily face them in the daylight. Yet they were too late. By nightfall, Eliza Witherton was found unconscious in her parlor. A vial of sleeping draught stood on the table, a single sheet of paper beneath her hand. The constable who found her called at once for Cray. Jessica, arriving shortly after, read the letter quietly by lamplight. "I could not let her ruin everything. My brother died because he loved her, and she used him. I only wanted peace. I never wished for blood. But peace never came. There was no signature. Only a smudge, as though a tear had blurred the ink." Jessica folded the page with trembling fingers. Gwen had sought acknowledgement, not vengeance. Yet her presence had unearthed guilt so corrosive that it had poisoned everything it touched, cups, names, memories, and now the woman who had tried to bury them all. Chapter 6, Secrets in China Blue. The Witherton house stood under a veil of grey afternoon light, its windows reflecting nothing but the pale drizzle that had resumed since dawn. Outside, a constable kept watch, his boots planted firmly on the path as if to prevent further ghosts from entering or leaving. Inside, Inspector Cray paced the parlor with measured steps, a man trying to sift order from a mess of lies. Jessica Fletcher stood in the kitchen, her eyes not on the inspector but on the china cupboard. The shelves gleamed with careful precision, saucers stacked by size, milk jugs turned inward, plates lined edge to edge. Everything bore the hallmark of Eliza Witherton's famous fastidiousness. Everything except for what was missing. "The forget-me-not cup." Jessica asked quietly, "May I?" The officer on duty gave a nod. She opened the cupboard doors and leaned down, examining the corners. Nothing. She pulled back the carpet by the sink. Still nothing. Then her gaze fell on the brown paper-lined bin, half filled with kitchen scraps. She lifted the lid. There, beneath a crust of burnt toast and a shriveled orange peel, shards of porcelain glinted. Blue forget-me-not petals shone faintly among the wreckage. The cup had been smashed and discarded with deliberate force. Jessica drew out a fragment with a cloth, turning it over gently. On the underside, barely visible in faded gold, was a single word, Sèvres. Her heart tightened. This was no ordinary village teacup. This was French diplomatic porcelain, rare and traceable. Gwen had not been sentimental when she brought it, she had been staking a claim. Later that evening, Jessica walked to the antique shop on the high street. Mr. Alcott, the proprietor, was a small, bespectacled man with yellow gloves and a suspicious eye. But when Jessica laid the fragment on his velvet pad, suspicion gave way to reverence. "Late 1800 Sèvres porcelain," he murmured. "French consular commission. Very rare indeed. One set went missing during the war. Rumored stolen from an estate in Provence. Do you recall who last owned it?" Jessica asked. Alcott pulled down a ledger and flipped through the brittle pages. "Ah. The Aubriac family. The last entry, a young girl, Genevieve Claire Aubriac." Jessica whispered the name as though it had been waiting for her, Gwen Halbert. She left the shop with the drizzle turning heavier, her umbrella sheltering little more than her thoughts. Gwen had not merely been a witness of old sins. She had been an heir, perhaps the very child struck through in the billeting records. Her cup was not an ornament, it was evidence of birthright, a message across time. Do you remember me? The following morning, Inspector Cray returned to Eliza's home with a warrant. Jessica accompanied him, Reeves trailing behind with notebook in hand. The attic smelled of cedar and mothballs, the dust thick enough to muffle their steps. They opened a heavy trunk bound with tarnished brass clasps. Inside lay dozens of envelopes, all addressed to Genevieve C. Aubriac. Each was marked return to sender. Some had been opened, others left sealed, all showing the relentless desperation of letters never delivered. Gwen had written them. Eliza had hidden them. At the bottom of the trunk lay a folded tapestry embroidered with forget-me-nots. The same pattern as the cup. Jessica touched it reverently. It was not just decoration, it was heritage, a family emblem preserved in thread and porcelain. Inspector Cray's jaw tightened. So Eliza Witherton tried to silence Gwen not only because of betrayal, but because Gwen could prove who she really was. Proof that could shift inheritances, reputations, everything. Jessica corrected him gently. She was silenced not only for what she was owed, but for what others feared losing. That evening, Jessica accompanied Cray to Lady Verwood's estate. The drawing room smelled faintly of lavender polish, the light dim beneath a brass lamp. Lady Verwood sat stiffly, hands folded. Cray spoke first. We know Gwen was Genevieve Aubriac. She had proof. The cup, the tapestry, the letters. And she knew someone in this village had once erased her. Lady Verwood's voice was low. I remembered her. The child. But I was young, terrified. I wanted a future without scandal. She was an inconvenience. Jessica's gaze was steady. And when she returned with evidence, you panicked. You saw the cup and the song forced you to remember. I didn't poison her, Lady Verwood snapped. I never touched the cup. Jessica tilted her head. Then who did? The widow's composure cracked. Eliza told me of Gwen's identity before the tea. She said we could lose everything. She spoke of protecting me. I didn't ask how. Jessica nodded slowly. So you didn't kill her, but you let it happen. Silence can be a weapon too. When they left the estate, Cray muttered bitterly, convenient denials. Jessica paused at the garden gate, raindrops sliding down her umbrella. Perhaps. But Gwen did not come to accuse Lady Verwood of murder. She came to remind her of truth. The murder came from someone who feared truth more than guilt. The next day, Jessica visited the local churchyard. Villagers spoke in whispers of a pale figure seen near the woods, a barefoot girl in white, humming softly. Some swore it was Gwen's ghost. Jessica listened politely but offered no comment. She knew memories could haunt as deeply as spirits. At the Lych gate, she paused. Flowers had been laid there, violets, forget-me-nots, and a small pressed leaf tucked discreetly among them. Jessica bent and touched it. Red maple. Gwen's signature. She had used it in her diary, in her letters, even in the hidden tin box. Jessica straightened, her resolve clear. Gwen's evidence was scattered across the village, left deliberately for someone to find. She had built a trail. The 13th cup was only the beginning. Back in her lodgings, Jessica spread the fragments on her writing desk, the torn diary page, the pressed leaf, the photograph of the tea set, the letter naming Vera Mollari. Each piece pointed toward the same conclusion: Gwen had come to St. Mary Mead not for vengeance, but for recognition. And someone, somewhere between the parlor and the garden, had decided recognition was too dangerous. Jessica poured herself a cup of Darjeeling into her own plain china, the steam curling upward like a question. The village thought Gwen's story ended with her burial. Jessica Fletcher knew better. A melody once sung, a cup once placed, a child once erased, such things did not fade. They lingered. They demanded to be seen. Chapter 7, The Ghost Child. The weather in St. Mary Mead turned sharp and bitter overnight. A restless wind rattled shutters and sent brittle leaves tumbling across the cobbled lanes. The village, still unsettled from Gwen Halbert's death and Eliza Witherton's collapse, woke to a new kind of unease. Whispers spread with astonishing speed. A ghost had been seen wandering the boundary of the Witherton property. The first account came from the vicar's wife, who claimed she had glimpsed a figure at dawn, a pale shape, barefoot, clad in a thin white gown, drifting near the hedgerows. By mid-morning, the tale had twisted itself into half a dozen versions. Some swore it was Gwen herself, returned to demand justice. Others insisted it was a child, humming a lullaby. And by the time Jessica Fletcher heard it at the grocer's, the story had already become legend. Jessica did not scoff. In her experience, gossip often cloaked truth in theatrical dress. She folded her paper bag of apples, thanked the shopkeeper, and walked back through the damp air, her mind moving not toward ghosts but toward the persistence of memory. That evening, Jessica accompanied Inspector Cray to the Witherton house. Eliza remained in hospital, alive but still unconscious, guarded as much by her own silence as by the infirmary walls. The parlor smelled faintly of lavender polish and mothballs, exactly as it had before, but now it carried an oppressive hush, as though the house itself waited for confession. Jessica climbed the staircase slowly, each step creaking in protest. At the far end of the corridor stood a door unopened during the earlier searches. She tried the handle. It yielded with a groan, revealing a small room lined with faded yellow wallpaper. A nursery, once. The iron bed frame stood bare, its paint flaking. A rocking horse slumped in the corner, its mane eaten by moths. The air held the faint scent of dust and camphor. Jessica moved to the wardrobe, its doors ajar. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in linen. She drew it out gently and unfolded it. It was a child's dress, white cotton, delicately embroidered, the fabric astonishingly preserved. Around the waist was a blue ribbon, precisely the shade of the forget-me-not cup. Pinned to the collar was a label, Genevieve Clare, Paris, 1943. Jessica inhaled slowly, as though holding a fragile memory in her hands. Not evidence for a courtroom perhaps, but proof of remembrance. Someone had kept this dress, hidden yet preserved, unwilling to discard what the past had demanded they forget. When she rejoined Cray downstairs, his notebook was already open. "Have you changed your mind?" he asked. "No," Jessica said softly. "But it's time the village hears what Gwen herself never had the chance to say." 2 days later, without announcement, a gathering formed at the church hall. The summons had traveled by whispers, by furtive knocks on doors, by the subtle current of shared curiosity. By 4 o'clock, every seat was filled. The vicar stood near the back, nervously fiddling with his watch chain. Lady Verwood sat in the front row, rigid as marble. Mr. Lennox, scar and all, was absent. Eliza, still in the infirmary, could not speak for herself. Jessica rose from her chair, her silver hair glinting in the lamplight. Her voice was calm but carried clearly. "Most of you knew Gwen Halbert as a quiet woman who kept to herself. But Gwen was not merely Gwen. She was Genevieve Clare Aubryac, the daughter of a French diplomat believed lost during the war. She survived. She grew, and she carried with her memories, some in photographs, some in letters, and one most especially in a single teacup painted with forget-me-nots. A ripple moved through the hall. She came to this village not for revenge, but for recognition. She wanted to be acknowledged by those who had once known her, and by those who had once abandoned her. The cup was not an ornament. It was her declaration, I remember you. Do you remember me? Jessica turned toward Lady Verwood. You recognized her, didn't you? The song, the cup, the eyes. They reminded you of a child you left behind. The widow's lips trembled. Yes, she whispered at last. I was 17. Terrified. She was, an impossible burden. Jessica nodded gently. Shame can silence a person for years. But silence does not erase truth. Gwen gave you the chance to admit it. And you chose not to. The room was heavy with stunned stillness. Someone near the back dabbed their eyes with a handkerchief. Jessica's gaze swept across the crowd. But Gwen was not silenced by shame. She was silenced by fear, fear from another who had far more to lose. The poison was prepared in advance. The cracked rim of her own cup was seeded with digitalis, waiting for her to fill it. She drank from what she thought was memory, but it became her undoing. Gasps rose. The vicar shifted uncomfortably. That person, Jessica said firmly, was Eliza Witherton. She knew Gwen's history, she knew the danger her return posed, and she chose to silence her permanently. Her own letter, discovered beside her, admits as much. She could not bear the destruction of what little dignity she believed she had left. A murmur of shock filled the hall. And yet, Jessica added, her voice softening, this was never truly about dignity. It was about a child erased, a family broken, and a memory too dangerous to acknowledge. Gwen wanted not vengeance, but remembrance. She wished only to be seen as who she truly was. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Lady Verwood buried her face in her hands. She was my daughter, she whispered, barely audible. Jessica let the silence stand. Sometimes silence carried more weight than any verdict. After the gathering, Jessica walked slowly down the lane behind the church. The trees swayed in the evening wind, branches whispering against each other. She paused when she heard it, faint humming drifting from the woods. She stepped cautiously into the clearing. There, among the shadows, stood a young woman in a worn white dress. Her hair was long and dark, her feet bare, her eyes distant. She cradled something invisible to her chest as though rocking a child. Jessica did not flinch. Genevieve, she said gently. The figure looked up and smiled faintly. No, she replied, her voice soft as wind. I am only the memory of her. Then she turned, drifting into the trees, vanishing as though she had never been. Jessica remained still for a long moment, her heart heavy yet calm. She knew what others would call it, a ghost, an omen, superstition. But Jessica understood differently. Memory, too, could take form. And sometimes it needed to. When she returned home, she set her plain china cup on the table. She poured her tea with steady hands, listening to the rain against the windows. Gwen had asked only one question, do you remember me? And at last, the village had answered. Chapter 8, Jessica Fletcher's Final Pour. Rain traced delicate lines down the windows of Jessica Fletcher's cottage the following morning, steady and persistent, as if the heavens themselves were inscribing something across the glass. The air smelled of damp earth and coal smoke, the familiar perfume of an English village after a storm. Yet inside, the atmosphere was not of comfort but of reckoning. Inspector Cray arrived just past 8. His raincoat was slick, his hat dripping as he stepped inside. He carried a small leather notebook bound with string, its edges worn, its pages yellowed. "We found this among Eliza Witherton's belongings," he said. His voice was heavy, not with triumph, but with fatigue. "You may want to read it." Jessica accepted the notebook and sat at her writing desk. The ink was dense, written in a precise but increasingly unsteady hand. Each entry was part memory, part confession. She came with her mother's eyes. "I thought the war had erased her, but she returned. She sang the song. She brought the cup. She is the cup. I tried to bury Edward's shame, but he loved her. He loved Genevieve, and she betrayed him. I wanted silence, but silence never came. I could not let her destroy everything." Jessica closed the notebook slowly. Eliza had not merely committed an act of desperation, she had lived inside a labyrinth of guilt for years, weaving her own justification until it hardened into inevitability. Gwen had arrived like a mirror, showing her what she had tried to forget. "She never woke again," Cray said quietly. "Died in the early hours. Officially, the coroner will call it suicide by overdose. The inquest will close with that." Jessica placed the notebook on the desk, her fingers still resting on its cover. "And Gwen? She'll be buried under her chosen name, Genevieve Claire Halbert. No trial. No charges. Just the record sealed as death by misadventure." Jessica looked out the window where rain still fell in a fine veil. So often, truth is tidied away like crumbs from a table. But crumbs remain. They always do. 3 days later, the funeral was held. The cemetery lay on the village's edge, where hawthorn hedges gave way to rolling fields. The service was brief, solemn. The vicar spoke of mercy, of storms endured, of names remembered by God even when forgotten by men. No grand eulogies were offered. Gwen had lived quietly, and so her burial was quiet as well. Jessica stood in her pale gray coat, her gloved hands clasped before her. The coffin, modestly adorned with violets, was lowered into the ground. The headstone already bore its inscription, Genevieve Claire Halbert, 1928 to 1953. She remembered. Someone left a fragment of porcelain on the grave, a jagged shard of Sèvres, blue forget-me-not petals still visible. Someone else, unseen, placed 13 forget-me-nots in a circle, each flower fresh and dewy. Jessica noticed but asked no questions. Some tributes were meant to be private. That evening, Jessica returned home. She lit her lamp, set aside her damp gloves, and poured herself a cup of Darjeeling into her plain rosebud china. She sat opposite Raymond West, her visiting nephew, who leaned forward with the curiosity of a writer hungry for details. "A murder at a tea party," he said, half grinning. "It sounds like one of my plots. Almost poetic." Jessica smiled faintly. "Murder often carries the rhythm of poetry, Raymond. But never for the victim." He tilted his head. "Do you think she came here for justice?" Jessica stirred her tea slowly. "Not justice as a court would define it. She came to be seen, to be acknowledged. To ask for a place that was once taken from her." "And did she get it?" "She got memory," Jessica said firmly. "And memory is the root of justice. The rest, verdicts, punishments, inheritances, they crumble in time. But memory endures. The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, the rain slowed, then ceased. A blackbird sang a hesitant tune from the hedge, as though testing whether the storm had truly passed. Later, when Raymond had retired upstairs, Jessica opened the drawer of her writing desk. Inside lay a small wooden box where she kept mementos from past cases, a dried rose petal, a faded train ticket, a key wrapped in ribbon. She added a new note on thick paper, written in her neat hand, the 13th Teacup, Brampton Hollow, GCH. Alongside it, she placed the Sevres shard recovered from the bin. She closed the box gently. Some mysteries ended in courtrooms, others in scandalous headlines. But the quietest, she knew, ended in parlor rooms, in diaries, in the private drawers of those who bore witness. The following spring, the violets bloomed again in Gwen's neglected garden. The roses clawed their way up the shed, and forget-me-nots pushed through the soil with stubborn grace. Villagers passing along the lane slowed as if compelled to lower their voices near the gate. No plaque marked the spot, no monument declared her story. But memory lingered, in the lullaby children hummed without knowing why, in the faint crack of porcelain remembered at the bottom of a tray, in the silence that followed Jessica Fletcher's gaze when neighbors grew too quick to gossip. For Jessica, it lingered in quieter ways still. Whenever she poured her tea, she glanced, just for a heartbeat, at the rim of the cup, as though to remind herself how fragile lives could be, how easily trust could be poisoned. And always, she listened for the faint echo of a melody. Doors, mon enfant. Doors. It had been sung once to soothe a child. It had returned to haunt a village. And it would remain, Jessica knew, not as a ghostly hymn but as a reminder, of betrayal, of truth, of memory's unrelenting weight. She lifted her cup, steady and deliberate, and drank. The firelight flickered against the walls. The village beyond her window grew quiet. Some mysteries, once solved, did not vanish. They lingered, like a melody hummed after silence, or a cup poured one too many times.